cinematography nerd. So I keep adjusting like the colors to try and make them true.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Kimberly, and I'm from the Country Bookshop in Southern Pines, and it is an honor to have y'all here live or watching this later. I'm going to introduce Nicole Chung and Chanda Prescod Weinstein, and then hand it over to the two of them for Weinstein um, for their chat. Nicole Chung is the author of the award-winning memoir A Living Remedy, which was named a notable book by the New York Times and a best book of the year by over a dozen other outlets. Her first book, All You Can Know, was a national bestseller and a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. Chung has written for the New York Times Magazine, the Washington Post, Time, Esquire, The Guardian, and many other publications. Previously, she was the digital editor director of Catapult, where she published hundreds of writers, co edited two anthologies, and helped lead its magazine to two National Magazine Awards. And most important for this conversation, she edited this book that she will be chatting about today with Chanda. Chanda Prescod, and I'll get it right this time, Weinstein like Einstein, is an associate professor of physics and astronomy and core faculty in women's and gender studies at the University of New Hampshire. She conducts award-winning theoretical physics research on dark matter, the early universe, and neutron stars, while also researching Black feminist science studies. Her first book, The Disordered Cosmos, A Journey into Dark Matter, Space-Time, and Dreams Deferred, won the 2021 Los Angeles Times Book Prize in Science and Technology and the 2022 Phi Beta Kappa Award in Science and a 2022 Penn Oakland Josephine Miles Literary Award. A columnist for the New Scientist and Physics World, she is originally from East LA and now divides her time between the New Hampshire seacoast and Cambridge, Massachusetts. And thank you both for being here today. The Country Bookshop is based out of North Carolina, and we hope that you get your copy of the book from us and visit us when you are in North Carolina.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. And Chanda, congratulations again on the edge of space time. And thank you so much for asking me to be in conversation with you today. It's an honor. I always love talking to you. And also, I have never actually had the chance to be in conversation with someone whose book I had a hand in editing. So this is a new experience for me. I believe you're going to start off with just a short reading. So I would love to hear that. And then we can jump into the conversation.
Thank you. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you in particular, Nicole, because you know this book in a way that other people I've talked to don't know the book. So I'm going to read from chapter 1, How to Live Safely in a Science Factual Universe. It would be easy to jump into the science and the metaphors without spending time thinking about what exactly we are doing when we do so. But if we are to think carefully about the fundamental nature of the universe and everything inside of it, from space-time to the invisible dark matter that we've never seen or touched, but feel fairly confident makes up most of the matter in the universe, then that means thinking carefully about metaphors and what work they are doing in our lives and scientific habits. As a physicist and science communicator, I live with the weight of the metaphors we choose in science, asking myself almost daily, is this the right one? What misunderstandings does this metaphor induce? I ask these critical questions while also knowing that I am completely dependent on metaphors for my own understanding. We live and breathe the world through metaphor, and our earliest metaphors have the power to govern our thinking. These are the lessons that Natasha Trethewey offers in her 2020 essay, You Are Not Safe in Science, You Are Not Safe in History, on abiding metaphors and finding a calling. In the essay, Trethewey meditates on her upbringing as a child of a white father and Black mother. It is here that I first saw these lines from Robert Frost's essay, Education by Poetry. What I am pointing out is that unless you are at home in the metaphor, unless you've had your proper poetical education in the metaphor, you are not safe anywhere. Because you are not at ease with figurative values, you don't know the metaphor and its strength and its weakness. You don't know how far you may expect to ride it and when it may break down with you. You are not safe in science. You are not safe in history. The first time I read Frost's lines in Trethewey's essay, I actually did a double take. I was reading this essay for a literary craft, not to study science craft. Yet there it was. You are not safe in science. You are not safe in history.
Thank you so much. I loved getting to hear you read. One reason I found this book so powerful and moving is because it does constantly remind me of the importance of poetry and of storytelling, and the fact that dreaming and storytelling, including dreaming and storytelling and thinking about the origins of the universe, which are also our shared origins, is really an inheritance that belongs to all of us. You make this point over and over. It's something we can and we should do together as human beings because it's a way of remembering and going back for our history and imagining a different or a better future. And I think many people might find it interesting. I know I certainly did as a writer that you chose to begin this book with this discussion of the importance of metaphor. Partly because, as you say, physics is a kind of dreaming that you engage in, that anyone can learn to engage in. And that it's also like a kind of poetry. Like you write this, it's made from metaphors, right? And it also inspires its own metaphors. And so you sort of link it to the study and the teaching of literature and poetry, and say that, like poetry and metaphor, physics can help us use our mind in a different way, which is such a powerful message to sort of reach for the abstract and what's confusing and what we don't know. So, can you talk about why you chose to begin the book this way and how you think about and work with the weight and power of metaphor as a scientist?
I mean, I think there are a lot of reasons, like personal reasons and also professional reasons. And I guess actually I want to start with an example that involves both of us, right? Which is like at multiple points in the book, I riff off the title of All You Can Ever Know and your own memoir. And one of the reasons that memoir was there in my mind was because it was so affecting and it was so powerful. And even though you're not talking about science or physics in that memoir, the framing of like what are the things that we come to know in our lives and how do we come to know them kind of became imprinted in my brain, and especially the rhetorical choice of like how you framed it with the title. And so it becomes this phrase that then my mind starts turning over and using in new ways, right? So then I start using it to think about like, how do we talk about dark matter, which is like, you know, supposedly all around us and makes up most of the normally gravitating matter in the universe, but is also something in some fundamental way that we will never know in the way that we know visible matter. Even if we get to the point where, like, you know, we've directly detected it in a laboratory, which we've never done, and we learn about some properties of it that we don't know about already, we still will never experience dark matter the way that I'm looking out my window right now, the way that I'm experiencing the trees outside my window. Like, I just won't have the same experience with it. And so I think, you know, Natasha Trethewey's essay about abiding metaphors really kind of invited me to think about what are the language and rhetorical choices that shape how I think about science and how I think as a scientist. And I loved books and I loved literature before I knew what physics was. And so I think there's also this piece that I love the literary. I think, and that shows in like you look at the subtitles of my books, right? And there's like Langston Hughes, and I actually for my first book had like a really big fight with my publisher about the subtitle of The
No
Disordered
kidding.
Cosmos. Yeah, of The Disordered Cosmos: A Journey into Dark Matter, Space-Time, and Dreams Deferred. And the publisher really didn't want Dreams Deferred, which is a reference to Langston Hughes. And we had like a long, like months long kind of back and forth about this. And I won't get into the
Wow.
details of how I won, but part of the argument and difference that we were having was around marketing and also around the literary. And for me, it was very important that the subtitle be literary in nature. And so I think there was also just a piece that, like, you know, in a lot of ways, the Disordered Cosmos got recognized a lot in the awards that Kimberly generously read off. I think part of the recognition it got was because I talked about a lot of the problems, the social and political problems within the physics community and the doing of physics. And so I think people often interpret that book as being extremely vulnerable for me. But I will say that I think like The Edge of Space-Time was a much more vulnerable book for me because it was really like if you have physicist brain, or if you have this particular physicist brain, this is what the world looks like. And so I think part of it was like, I think in lines from books that stick with me, lines of poetry that stick with me. And then I think there was also the practical element of like, I don't know, they call it like breaking the fourth wall, where you kind of like turn to the camera and talk to it. And so there was an element of, I could just like sit here and talk about physics, or I could actually talk to you about the methodological problem I have of talking physics. And whenever I make this comment, I think about this line from Audrey Enriches' poetry where she says, "This is the oppressor's language, yet I need it to talk to you." And so I wouldn't say like I would call physics the oppressor's language, but I do think that spending a lot of time with that line as I grew into adulthood got me thinking a lot about what it means to need language to talk to someone and what language you need to talk to someone. And so there was also just an element of like turning to people and saying, this is I need metaphor to talk to you. Let's just be open with each other about the fact that like you don't know equations, or I can't assume you know equations. So I need some other toolkit to talk with you. Here's what it looks like. And then actually while I was writing it, I think I kind of talked myself into the idea that an equation is a metaphor, which like was not something that's that's something that's in that chapter, but it wasn't something I had planned going in.
I love when like just the writing process itself, or like surprises you in that way, which language does constantly. But you're all, like that is what it means to try to write a book, is to try to find language for some things in this book that like many of us would find inexpressible. I've been telling people since I got to read it the first time, and I realize it's changed a lot since I read an earlier draft, but I've been saying this is a book for everyone, by which I mean I felt like it was for me. And as we've discussed, I barely remember my high school science classes. You're probably tired of hearing me say this, but this is for the benefit of the rest of you. If you don't remember your high school physics class, or you do and it was a nightmare for you, don't be afraid of this book, because it's truly
Thank
a
you.
joy. I feel like it's a book, first of all, that is for everyone, but also feels like a book like no other scientist, no other physicist could have written. And part of it is the way you use language, and also just the way you think about language and how you say, look, honestly, like, I read this book and I read every sentence trying to understand, but like if I were trying to explain certain concepts to other people, I know I'd get it wrong. But what has stuck with me is this completely new way of thinking about the universe, and thinking about the unknowable, and thinking about confusion as a place to start, and an exciting place to start, not a place to be overwhelmed and stop thinking. Like that is one of the things this book did for me. I also think it's just an especially urgent and important book to read right now, right? With, I don't know, like this time we're all living through and trying to survive with our home planet in the cosmos in peril. I'm curious though, like with all the work and the writing you've already done, and obviously I'm including your academic work in that, and your first book, The Disordered Cosmos, where do you see the edge of spacetime kind of fitting? Why was this the book you wanted to write right now for this moment?
I mean, I guess if we were talking about this chronologically, the moment at which like I was working on the book proposal and making the deal with Pantheon to write the book, I had already heard from my department that they had voted for me to be awarded tenure. And I knew that that had been confirmed at the college level. And so I was fairly certain that that would go through with the board of trustees. And so I was in the process of getting tenure, which for people who are outside of academia, this is basically like everything in your scientific career is like leading up to this moment where at least it used to mean before the GOP started taking over everything and I'm trying to get protections, employment protections, it used to mean that you would be very hard to fire unless you did something that you shouldn't do. But you had a lot of intellectual freedom. You were affirmed by the community that this was like a lifelong position, that you could continue your intellectual work. And there are a lot of caveats that come with like the process of getting tenure, and that includes working on things and making the right kind of political choices and intellectual choices so that you can get enough papers out, so that you have the right number of publications, that you get the right grant money, that your PhD students graduate on time. Like in my first 6 years as a faculty member, I graduated 3 PhD students, which is pretty high for a theoretical physicist. And So it was a moment when I was kind of like looking around and reassessing what are the things that I had to leave behind in order to get tenure, because that's the moment. There's a lot of, I don't know, I guess, like, speaking of references, I I love Tom Cruise movies, and so there's a lot of don't think, just do. That's a Top Gun reference for anybody who, like, but there's a lot of like, you just have to keep going. You can't stop and meditate because, like, everything is about, I need to get tenure. And so, really, after you get tenure, it's supposed to be a celebratory thing, but actually, it can be this very emotional, like, now I can feel all my feelings that I wasn't letting myself feel. And so, there was an element with the edge of space time of, I want to go back to the fundamental questions that got me excited about physics in the first place, and that sometimes physicists are actually not encouraged to think about. And that was what I had in mind. And then, of course, like, a book tells you about itself while you're writing it. And so, and you have editors who get involved who make suggestions. Like, I think about, like, a key one that you made was, I talk at some point about T.S. Eliot's poem Burnt Norton. And you were like, no, you really should pursue getting permission to include those lines in the book, which, like, did cost me money, but was absolutely worth it financially. Like, the investment was worth it. So those are all things that kind of happen in the aftermath, that you're like, oh, actually, this thing is important to me spiritually, that I need to include it. Um, and then you go off on tangents. Like, I read Isaac Newton's writing for the first time as part of this process. And, like, I've literally been a physicist for over 2 decades. And this was my first time actually reading Newton's laws as written by Newton, like, in context of the text. And so there's a lot of, I think that was a piece of it. And the other piece is I was doing a lot of national policy work, and I was seeing the writing on the wall with astrophysics funding and cosmology funding and particle physics funding. And on a level, the book is a plea to the general public. Don't let me be the last part of the last generation that does this kind of work. I believe that in a functioning democracy, and I mean this in a global sense, not a nationalist sense, that you want to have a group of people who are the story keepers, who keep this cosmological story, who keep particle physics, and who share the lessons and those messages with society. And that's actually part of having a functioning democratic society that reflects the fullness of humanity, because thinking about this stuff is something humans do. And so, if we're not given the space time to do it, then there's a piece of our humanity that is being held back. So there was also, I think, increasingly, especially, I started the book before October 7th, 2023. And then actually had several months after October 7th where I was like, I can't work on this because I just need to focus on trying to stop the genocide on Gaza. And then having to accept at some point the genocide isn't going to stop before I have to finish and turn this book in. And so there was like a growing urgency of like the different things and stories that I needed to kind of weave into it and address. And at the same time be like, actually, the cosmos is awesome. The world doesn't feel awesome right now, but the cosmos, which the world is a part of, actually is awesome.
So when you talk about, okay, one reason I have loved your work for so long is the way that you talk about like big abstract ideas, and also like the shared dreaming that we could all do, we all should get to do about the cosmos. And for some, I guess for some people, this could be like a reason to like look up or look away from like things that are happening in the world, like everything that we're struggling against here. But you never do that. You always like beg people to look around and to think about where we can make a difference and what we have to fight for here on our home, and also insist in this way I find very powerful and very inspirational, that it is also part of our shared work to like think about these star stories, as you call them, and not because holding on to that, it's holding on to a piece of our humanity, really. And for as long as I have known you, so now I'm going to talk about how we met. With like this has been something you have done with like this fervor that I admire so much. So we initially met like probably on Twitter, a place I cannot recommend to anyone anymore, but it was one of the first places we connected. And then at some point, you approached me with this article that you'd written that had you'd found a home for it, and then it ended up not being placed there, and you were looking specifically to place it in you'd written it for a general audience, right? It wasn't an academic article. I was at the time the managing editor of the Toast, and we published a lot of stuff, but I have to say, like, we didn't publish a lot of difficult scientific concepts. But as soon as I heard about this article, I knew I wanted the community to see it. And I also wanted to see like what their reaction was. I love just kind of putting interesting, fascinating work in front of that community and like letting them go to town. And I wasn't actually surprised that they were so positive and said, we want to read more of this. But like, I think you were a little surprised. But can you talk about just why it was so important to you and why it still is? And why you do that work with such like fervor, like reaching out to non-scientific audiences, because I mean, obviously you're a leading scholar in your field and you could just focus on academic circles, academic work, your students, and that would be completely understandable. But you are always reaching out to those beyond the science, like what we would think of as the scientific community. And can you share a little bit more about why that's always been so important to you?
Yeah, I mean that story. So I actually think maybe the first place we connected was the binders on Facebook.
Are you serious?
I
Okay,
think
sorry for getting that wrong.
I could be wrong about that. I mean, also, I guess like, did I just break a rule? Are we allowed to talk about the binders? I don't know. Like,
I think everybody knew about them. I don't think you're the one, like,
no,
like breaking that. Sorry. So I
I
think it's
didn't
okay.
write an article for Vogue about it, so I think that we're good. But I think when I came to you with that, the story is actually like you were very generous. It was actually an article I had been commissioned to write by a publication that published science writing on a regular basis. And the message that I had gotten about it was basically like, you did this in the wrong voice, like it's too colloquial. And I was like, but I wrote it in a voice that I thought would speak to an audience that I want to attract into science, reading science writing. And so I came to you with it, and you were like, well, I don't really know like what I'm doing with science writing, but sure, I'll try this. And actually, I can, this is one of the reasons that I asked for you to come back for the Edge of Space Time. I think that you're one of the best editors I've worked with, because I think you get what I'm trying to do and you kind of like shepherd me in the right direction when you think that I've gone off track. And, in terms of like the experience that I had with that, I think up until that point in kind of my life, my experience, particularly in feminist spaces, with people reacting to talking about big ideas from physics. So that particular article was about an idea called that we sometimes call dark energy. And it was actually about like why I kind of hate calling it dark energy, right? And I think what we ended up calling it something like what to do about the problem of cosmic acceleration. It was like a Sound of Music reference
Yeah.
of some kind. And my experience up until that point was that people saw physics as, well, it's clearly all derivative from the Manhattan Project, and it is the scientists are the ones who never support the humanist academics who are under attack in the academy, like financially, and so physics is kind of a threat to us. And I was used to really having to vigorously like make the case that like someone like me, like a feminist physicist, could exist. And then like the Toast audience, like the comment section was like one of the most affirming experiences that I've had in my entire career as a scientist or a writer, because people were just like, this is fucking awesome. Can we have more? Right. And I think that I have no idea how much that was like a factor in like, people giving me more opportunities, but it was also this great public archive of actually, there's an audience for her writing that is not the imagined audience of science publications. And in fact, the voice that I had written the article in was an important voice for science writing to be done in. And it was just a matter of finding a platform for it. And so I think that really affirmed for me that I needed to stick with that and be really insistent about it. And I think that that's one of the reasons that my books, or at least I can say my first book, was successful in the way that it was. And I think The Edge of Space Time has had the wide support that it's had, is that like queer audiences know that I'm writing to them and know that I'm writing with them in mind. Black audiences know that I'm writing with them in mind. People know that I'm not going to shy away from telling the stories of women that I think need to be recognized. Like I talk a lot in this book about Qian Sheng Wu, who gets mentioned in physics books sometimes, but I don't think often doesn't always get centered in the way that I try to center her in the physics story. So not a matter of like doing biography, so much as like intellectual biography of this is a person whose name you should know and should be of significance. And I know that readers trust me to do that and to be engaged with it. And I think that that's like also one of the things that keeps me going is that I know I want to live in a world where that kind of writing exists. And one of the ways that I can contribute to that world existing is by being one of the people who does the writing. And I think a piece, like I know Nichole, as someone who's published books and edited books, you know this, but I don't know if it's always apparent to readers how important the success of a book that does something different can be for the future of what publishing opportunities become available for other writers. And so with the Disordered Cosmos, I was very aware that if the book did well, that there was a whole type of writer that would be given an opportunity by the publishing industry that otherwise might have the door slammed in their face. And in fact, if the Disordered Cosmos did badly, that people were going to say, someone tried that, it didn't sell well. So as much as I love your writing and I love your idea, I can't I can't publish you. And so there is kind of this element also of pressure that comes with that.
Right.
But also, as someone with tenure and someone who has had a first successful book, there's now kind of this feeling of like, well, so far I've been able to push that boundary forward. And you can see in the book deal announcements, people citing the Disordered Cosmos as like one of the comps.
A comp title. Yeah.
Yeah. And so there is this element of like, well, maybe I'll just keep pushing those boundaries. Like, I'm at the edge. Why don't I just like shift where that edge is?
When you said that you had found a voice that it was important to build a platform for just now, I just kept thinking like you're one of the people who's built that platform. And without you, it might not exist, which is something I think you're referencing more modestly when you talk about publishing, the way it works, and the importance of one book for potentially opening the door to many other types of books. So like, thank you for acknowledging that because it's something that I've encountered and I've thought a lot about in my own career as well. But you're right. I don't think that's as visible necessarily to everyone outside of publishing. I wanted, oh yes, please.
Can I just add something onto that? Just as an example, I think it's either next week or the week afterwards. I think it's next week. Carmela Padovich Callaghan, who is a physicist and science writer, has a memoir coming out called Entangled States.
And, oh wow, that's an amazing title.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful, beautiful book, and it used the Disordered Cosmos as a comp. And I blurbed it. So I've read the book. I think it's really good and people should pick it up. And it's different from The Disordered Cosmos because The Disordered Cosmos was not a memoir and Entangled States actively is. But it truly takes the idea of like personal essay and physics writing and does something new with them. And that's an example of a book, and I've had this conversation with Carmela, that I don't think their book would have had the opportunity had the Disordered Cosmos not happen. So one, I just want to say, please pre-order that book. I'm sure you can get it through Country Bookshop. And also, if people are kind of wondering like what's an example of what that means in practice, that's a clear-cut example of what that means in practice.
Thanks for sharing that. I wrote it down and I'm definitely going to check it out. So I appreciate the rec. Okay, so I just want to like tell you a little bit about my process when I was editing this book. Bear with me. So like you needed it turned around fairly quickly. So I if you remember, I sort of cleared my schedule to focus on it for a couple of weeks. So I would spend hours editing. And then at some point, the dog would make her needs known and I would like have to go walk the dog. And I would spend the entire walk thinking about what I just read and like trying to remember the details to some degree and like repeat them to myself, because to me that was the test of like, am I understanding? Because I know we had talked about how much you really wanted this book to be very accessible to non-scientists like me. So I was like, if I can not only read it and understand what I'm reading, but also like think about it later and repeat it to somebody else, like then that shows I have some kind of understanding. It was a really good time. And a lot has stayed with me since then. But you share a ton of science in the book, obviously. And I wanted to choose one example that I still think about to focus on in a deeper way in the discussion. And it's the way you actually introduce quantum mechanics in the book and explain how it is in many ways what we've been talking about. It is this entirely different way of thinking. It's like using your brain in a completely different way than we normally do. And you explain how it's understanding systems as compared to like the classical understanding of physics. Most of us non-physicists, if we took science classes in school, we never got beyond the realm of the classical where we can sort of look at what we know, observe, and then with the right equation, like make a reasonable prediction about what will happen. Because as you say in this book, if you control the conditions, you can be certain about some outcomes. And then you say in this book that only gets us so far because the universe is fundamentally quantum mechanical in nature. I swear I'm going somewhere with this, but you like walk readers through this using experiments, which you explain, this, like the Stern-Gerlach experiments that can help us develop a feel for the quantum nature of the universe. Don't worry, I will not try to explain it here. But the point of this, and the reason I'm bringing it up, is because physicists had to learn a new way of thinking. Because only you had a classical understanding of the universe, but it couldn't explain the results of that experiment. Only quantum mechanics could. And so that opened the door to all these tantalizing new questions. So the question I actually have for you is again about this question of how we confront both what we can observe and what we can't, like what's more abstract and what confuses us or makes us mad or we don't really understand yet, and how that actually changes how we see the world, right? And how we exist in the world. You talk about curiosity in this way that is really transformative. And I was wondering if you could say more about this, about both the types of questions quantum mechanics opens up for us as humans, but also what questions you're hoping readers of this book, including non-scientists, sort of take up for themselves. Because I feel like that is one thing this book really called me to do as a reader.
Yeah, I love this question. And I also think, the way that you were able to lay it out is such a great example of like what I wanted the reader to take away, that you like walked away with exactly what I wanted you to take away, which is that like there's a piece of this that's about the way in which grappling with physics requires you to allow your perspective to be changed. That you have to be open to what I thought the world was is not what the world is. And, the example that's easier to give without some diagrams, like one of the challenges with the Stern-Gerlach experiment is it's very hard to explain. Like I worried so much while I was writing that section. In the book, there are really good drawings that my best friend Sharifa Williams did to go with it. And I worried so much about the audiobook. And
oh, that's such a good point.
I worried so much about the audiobook because I, like many people, read books via audio. I don't always read with something in my hands. And I do think that reader should be attended to and taken care of. They also get a PDF so they can pull up the diagrams. I think eventually I even put a note into the book that basically is specifically speaking to the audiobook reader. That's like, you may need to listen to this again or whatever, because and so there was an element of, I know I'm walking my reader through things and it's going to feel a little bit uncomfortable because there are various moving parts and new concepts. But also, what I want the reader to understand about the experience that they're having here is not that I want them to have the Stern-Gerlach experiment memorized or even be able to explain to people in detail what the experiment was. I want them to have the experience of sitting with it one time, and the way in which doing that just makes you ask questions, because that's what the process of thinking physics is. It's not about comfortably knowing how things work. it is about being really at the edge of where that comfort ends and where your discomfort with confusion begins. And then just being like, okay, I can sit with the discomfort of confusion, or I don't remember the details of this thing, but I know that at the end of it, that the math that I need to describe it involves something called imaginary numbers. And I know that that's different. And part of it is just wanting people to know that the universe is weird like that. And so on some level, like the only conclusion I want people to have is that like I'm and the example I give in the book, I was obsessed with the Count from Sesame Street as a child. I loved the bats and I loved like batty, batty, batty. Like I just loved that whole thing. And so the example, I'm like, so what if we confront the situation where Sesame Street didn't tell us about all the numbers we need to know? Because that's actually the thing. There is this thing called the imaginary numbers that we suddenly need. So why don't I just kind of say what I think Sesame Street would do with this, right? Like where Count Von Count, which is his full name, by the way, has to kind of grapple with what if he's counting bats that aren't there? And the bats that aren't there have physical significance. So even though they're not there, this imaginary number has physical significance. So I think there is a piece of that where I'm just like, the act of trying to make sense of it in whatever way that manifests for you is actually the point. The point is it's not a textbook. There's no test at the end. Like the point, of course, there is going to be a subset of the audience that like is like, whoa, I'm obsessed with this experiment now and I'm really into it. And on a level I'm writing like for the you know, teenager me, that was like that person who would have been trying to figure it out, right? But I don't think you have to be that person for the book to be serving you. And I should say, by the way, the Stern-Gerlach experiment is also one of those things. Like, I think the version of the text that you got to edit, I was working on when I was at a workshop in Santa Barbara in January of last year. And the workshop was for theoretical particle physicists. So it's all like the biggest math nerds in the physics community. And we were sitting at lunch one day and people were asking me some questions about my book. And I was like, yeah, so I'm really excited about this chapter on the Stern-Gerlach experiment, which basically, I should say, the Stern-Gerlach experiment basically forces us to acknowledge that the act of making a measurement can change the outcome of an experiment. That's one of the lessons. It's not the only lesson. Another lesson is that you need to measure energy in these like quantum numbers of you can't have 1.5. You can only have an energy level of 1 or 2 or 3, but nothing in between. And so there are all these lessons. And so I'm like talking to people about like why I think this experiment is so important and it's my favorite one. And everybody at the table is just like looking at me. They've stopped eating and they're sitting there and they're like, what's wrong with you? Like, why would you try and explain that experiment? Everybody, and it was really just kind of like everybody knows that you can't tell the general public about it because it's too confusing. And so there was an element of this that was also just like, well, I believe that it is part of the work of trying to figure out how we might try. And I don't know if this will be the best rendering of this experiment I ever do in my career, but I think it was important for me to try. And I think similarly, that's all I'm asking of the reader, right? And broadly, in this moment where I have to argue with my students about whether they should do the math for their assignments because there is a code that will do that math for them. So why should they? I wanted to say that your mind is important and shaping your mind is important and using your mind is important. And the process of just reading this section and reckoning with the idea that physicists did this weird experiment that fucked with everybody's heads, that's enough. I want people's minds to be shaped by that. And that's all, really.
It's really, I mean, it's the same discussions that we're having with a lot of writers and just students across different fields. Like, yeah, when you say that you don't have to understand every concept or be able to repeat it to your dog the way I was trying to do on walks to get something of real value, I think I think this is just like a mind broadening book. And that can be true for like any reader. Um, like, so you open this book by talking about thinking about physics and cosmology as one way for us to recall like our shared stories and also be in a real discussion with our ancestors who looked to the stars and who wanted to understand their place in the universe too. And, it's easy to think of this as a really fraught time in which to live, but also to pursue scientific inquiry, right? But there's also been like weirdly no time in history, right? When we as humans have known as much about the cosmos as we do today for all that we still have to learn. And it must be like such an interesting thing to confront those two different truths at the same time. I feel like you write in this book very powerfully about our responsibilities to each other. And you're really clear, as I mentioned before, about things we're up against and suffering and struggles. But you write in this way that never really allows for despair. And at some
Mm.
point, it struck me that just like among its many other strengths, this is just a great book for people to read to remind themselves there are concrete reasons to hope and to fight for like a more just future. So living in a time that can feel really bleak for any number of reasons, how do you think about your work and your role as like a scholar and a writer? And like what, if anything, helped you work and think and write the way you do in a way that really renounces the temptation to ever despair?
I'm, I really appreciate this question. And I think, one of the things that we don't necessarily admit to ourselves is that we are steeped in anti intellectual politics right now. And I don't mean like, everybody has to go to college or anything like that, or that, we should revere authority, intellectual authority in an unquestioning way. But we are steeped in a politics that encourages misinformation, where politicians comfortably engage in levels of disinformation that we haven't seen on the scale and across topics in the way that we're seeing now. I don't think we've ever seen it before. Like I can think of like, there were a lot of people who were invested in race science in the 19th century. And so like we've definitely seen situations where politicians were very invested in like disinformation about science. But I don't think that we've seen that level of manipulation across topics the way that we are now. And in that sense, it's like a weird time to be writing a book, because a book is fundamentally, I don't know, I'm sure there are books that are counterexamples to this, but I will say, like, broadly speaking, a book is an intellectual project that believes in thinking and believes in people's minds and believes in the idea that people should be asked to think about something outside of themselves for, you know, 10 to 300 pages, whatever the number is. Um, and I think as a writer, it can be very easy to despair right now, because um, even as like independent bookstores seem to be in a resurgence, which I really, really love, there are ways in which we are all just fighting with the Amazon business model and the impact that that has on book acquisitions. We're dealing with consolidation of publishers that makes it harder to get a good book deal. Something that like writers or readers don't often appreciate if you're not a writer is that, for example, if you get an offer from two different imprints that are within the same big five publisher, those imprints aren't necessarily allowed to compete with each other financially. And so getting two offers does not necessarily allow you to increase the amount of money that you get paid. And so functionally, even if you don't understand the details of that, what we're seeing is a suppression of wages for a lot of writers. And also in that consolidation, it means that we're all coming to the same publicity and marketing trough. And those publicity and marketing professionals are both overworked and sometimes having to make difficult decisions about which books they will put their energy into and which ones they won't. And so I will just say, like, even from so maybe I realize the question wasn't really about the publishing industry, but I will say, like, the act of like spending time on a book and like actually writing the book is like, you have to be a very optimistic person on a level, or you have to have some optimistic strain working in you
That
where
is true.
you're
Yeah.
where you will believe, I will write this book and at least one person will walk into a bookstore and buy it and read it and that the book will find an audience and will find its people. So I will say that like the act of writing is actually in itself a kind of anti-despair technology. I think that that's really important. Even as you have people writing sometimes the most despairing shit while they're writing, the fact that they believe in the act of writing as a practice is a very optimistic thing to do. And I think we need all of the practices of optimism that we can get. So there was also an element of like, I had to try and maintain a belief that like my weird, black, queer, rainbow covered, like literally rainbow covered book about that uses the phrase quantum field theory in it would find an audience. And I knew that that audience, like the people who were going to seek me out, were not like um the kinds of people who have problems with discussions about racism and problems with discussions about feminism. And so there was a whole, not necessarily majority, but slice of the science, self-imagined I read science books audience that was going to self-select against my writing. And that meant I had to have faith that people who maybe don't always imagine themselves as science readers were going to give me a chance. And so I think that there's kind of an optimism in that. And then there was a piece of, in the introduction, I say the universe is too fucking fabulous for capitalism, y'all. And I just like, in the greater scheme of you have star formation, the cosmic microwave background radiation, you have star formation, galaxies form, multiple generations of stars have to happen before a planet like Earth can be formed. Supernovae have to happen. All this fusion has to happen. The fusion requires quantum tunneling. And then at the end of it, you have this like moment on one planet within one species where people come up with this stupid fucking economic system. And I'm supposed to believe that that's like the truth of the universe. Like it's such a small fragment of what the universe is. And so I think that was, we're all looking around thinking about how can we contribute given what we have to offer the world. And I think the thing that I can offer the world is that perspective that capitalism is a tiny, crappy thing in a very, very big, strange, incredibly queer universe. And that perspective can help us, you know, maintain our sense of, well, I should keep going because maybe there's something better on the other side.
This, I mean, this sort of leads into my next question, although not everyone will pick up on why. Um, okay, I have to ask you about Star Trek because we have both loved it all our lives. And your epigraph for this book is actually like this perfect quote from Star Trek Discovery. And you talk about multiple different series and characters and like just like ideas that the show explores throughout the book. Can you just talk about some of the ways in which that fictional futuristic universe influenced or inspired you, specifically like how it helped you do what you're talking about here, like look toward a future of like meaning and community? Because I've sensed that that's like part of what like Star Trek means to you. But I would just love to hear you talk about it.
I will say, so first of all, the book has an epigraph from from it's the opening sequence, the opening monologue from Star Trek Discovery season 2, like the very beginning of the season. And as a writer, you can't actually do something like that for free.
It would normally be very expensive, yes.
That's a very like extremely copyrighted thing. And I got permission for it for free from Paramount before the sale went through because the Trekkie fan community is such an incredible family community that different people called in favors until like one day I got an email from a lawyer at Paramount giving me the requested permission.
It's amazing.
And I think for me, part of my commitment to Star Trek is seeing what it brings out in people. And I will say, like, I go to the Star Trek convention in Las Vegas every year, and every year there are Trump voters there. And that's always like a very interesting experience. And so I think there is this tendency to talk about Star Trek as if like everybody um who's involved in Star Trek or loves Star Trek and loves doing the cosplay and stuff is like committed to the idea of a socialist utopia. And not everybody interprets the text in that way. But I should say that actually many of us do. And actually, even within those spaces, I find myself having conversations with people like Trump voters that I might not ever be in community with in any other space, where I was able to start making sense of like, how is this person thinking about like the political choice that they are making? Um, because like on a level, what I did find is like on an individual level, like when we're all standing in line, we make sure that everyone's being treated fairly in terms of like who was here and who gets access. Does someone need to go to the bathroom? And there are all of these like little things. And I think Star Trek, part of what I came to in writing this book is, so a lot of people are like, well, I'm not a Star Trek fan. Am I going to understand the book? And when I think I explain what you need to know, but I also think we're at a point culturally and politically where Star Trek is like a text that everybody needs to have some familiarity with for political reasons, because we have so many political leaders who are using it as a reference point. Like you have Pete Hegseth, who's actually on stage doing this symbol. It's helpful if you know that this represents live long and prosper. And that Leonard Nimoy, the actor who introduced this to the franchise as the Vulcan Spock, saw someone in a synagogue, an Orthodox synagogue, when he was a child in Boston, make a hand symbol similar to this. And it was meant to represent, as he understood it, may God be with you, or something along those lines. And that there is a cultural representation there of goodwill towards other people that when Pete Hegseth is doing this, he does not represent. And people, I think it's helpful for people to be able to interpret that, to also interpret like so that happened in a very specific, like he and Elon Musk were doing an event together. And they were basically like, everything that the Space Force does is bringing us into the Star Trek future. I want people to be able to understand why that is a lie. It's fine to be like, well, I just assume that guy is a liar because I don't like him. But I would prefer you to be able to rationalize why you think someone is a liar rather than like lean on the ad hominem, as tempting as that might be. Right. And so I do think that for me, Star Trek became this like really important text for kind of thinking through what society do we want to live in. And I think that it offers us lessons about like how we should think about the place of science in society, which is that it's there to bring out our humanity. It's not there to help us build things that destroy parts of humanity that other parts of humanity want to eradicate.
You have this chapter late in the book that touches on like just the colonization of space, but also just like this, like the extraction of, whatever we come across in space. And I have to say, you more than any other person I know or have read has really shaped my personal thinking when I hear about everything from the Artemis mission to Elon Musk. One of my early questions is like, has Chanda written about this? Like, what would Chanda say about it? Because there's a lot of talk right now about like escaping our planet, right? And like it's often couched in these grandiose terms about exploring the stars, but and like not, you don't even have to dig too deep to find these like very exploitative, extractive, like vocabularies around it. And you refer to this in your book as frontier science, right? And so I guess I'm asking, like, on the other side, what does it mean to really dream freely about going into space, like reaching further into the stars, but to do this in ethical or transformative ways that benefit everyone and not just make a few people richer?
Yeah, so the book, the closing, like the full closing chapter of the book, "You Are Not Safe in Science," which hopefully listeners here will recognize where I got that line from, is an adaptation of an essay that I wrote for the Baffler. And a significant restructuring. I'm sure, Nichole, as you were like looking through it, you were like, this is a very different version of this chapter than the one that I read. I actually rewrote that chapter after the first past pages. So people who got the arc didn't even see the version that went
Oh, wow.
into the final. Um, and I think that was actually like one of the problems that the last like couple of years of politics presented with me. It was actually trying to keep up with what is the tenor that this chapter should have, because like now there's a new political thing that I need to figure out. And at some point the book has to be frozen. But one of
The
the
challenge of
challenges,
nonfiction. Yeah.
yes, is that like you don't know what world the book is going to go out into, but it needs to
Yeah.
feel relevant when it comes out. And it needs to feel relevant 5 years after that, too. You hope that it's still in print 5 years later. Um, and so the Baffler had come to me with actually 2 weeks' notice and been like, could you write an essay about this thing this Nobel laureate said about how Earth is really our only planet and we can't really just move to an exoplanet just because we've been finding all of these exoplanets? And around the time I'd been asked, I was kind of grappling with, I had seen Nikki Giovanni in conversation with Kiese Lehman on a virtual Wisconsin Book Festival conversation. And Nikki Giovanni had started going on and on about growing okra on Mars during this conversation. And I like panicked because I was like, no, Nikki, this is like planetary, like you're defiling Mars. We should not be putting human fauna and flora, like flora and fauna and like all of this stuff on Mars. And so then I got this request from the Baffler, and I was like, I need to not assume that when Nikki Giovanni says it, she means the same thing as when Elon Musk says it. And so I kind of gave myself this challenge of trying to understand. In her poetry, Nikki Giovanni talks about going to Mars a lot and trying to figure out, well, what if I think about this, she was such a key figure in the Black arts movement at a time when, the civil rights movement was very visible and a lot of transformation was happening. She understood Mars as part of her liberation narrative. And so the task before me was to think about, like, well, what did Nikki Giovanni mean? And I don't think that I come to strong conclusions of, like, I know that this is what is required to get from point A to point B. But I think part of what I try to do is lay down a framework of these are the questions that we should be asking ourselves. And here are some of the writers and thinkers and characters that we might want to reference, right? So I end the chapter by coming back to the character of Michael Burnham from Star Trek Discovery, who is the character that narrates that opening monologue. That's the epigraph of the book. And so there's kind of a loop around of like, this is she's telling a star story in that epigraph that is a true star story, by the way, which I didn't know until I was like researching. And then I was like, oh, this is actually the writer's room for Star Trek Discovery did their homework about African cultures. And so there's an element of we need to follow their lead, the writer's room's lead of where do they look for their cultural reference point? What becomes their orienting reference?
I have like 5 million more questions for you, but we are almost at 1 o'clock. So, and I want to be aware of your time. So reluctantly, I'm going to have that be my last question. But is there anything we did not cover that you think is important for people here or people watching later to know about your book?
I guess I will just say, because I'm wearing, for maybe someone in the audience recognized that I'm wearing a Lower Decks uniform. I actually don't talk about Star Trek Lower Decks, which is like an animated comedy series. I don't talk about it very much in the book, but I do think that it reflects the ethos of Lower Decks and that the book has a lot of whimsy in it. There's a lot of joking around in the book. And when I was in graduate school, I saw more times than I should have, like physicists yelling at each other. I saw a guy punch a chalkboard once. And the whole time I was like, but it's like theoretical physics. Like, it's not that serious. Like, this is not like a life or death thing.
You're like, calm down.
Really, calm down, have fun. And so I think, like, the book does grapple with these kind of serious issues of like how we're going to get ourselves out of the fascist catastrophe that we are in, but also you're supposed to have fun. That's actually, I want you to have fun, and I want you to like be walking around thinking about like what Beckett Mariner the carefree Black girl who's the lead of Lower Decks would be thinking, if she was drunk on like Romulan wine and carrying around a bat'leth, which, um, if you know Lower Decks, you
Which
know what scene I'm
happens.
talking about.
Well, I agree. The book is, I mean, you say that explicitly in the intro. You want people to have fun. And I really did reading this book. And I continue to think about it. Like specific things just live rent free in my head now. So thank you for that. And thank you so much for the conversation today and for the opportunity to work on this book. And for your friendship. Like it has and continues to mean so much to me. And I'm just so happy for you that this book is out and that other people get to encounter and enjoy it.
Nicole, thank you so much for helping to bring this book to life. I really appreciate it.
It was a privilege. You know that. And thank you so much to Country Bookshop for hosting us today. This was a lot of fun, and thank you to those of you who joined us. It was like just wonderful to be here talking about Chanda's great book.
Yeah, I really appreciate we had an audience, which I wasn't sure we would do in the middle of the day. So please tell your friends to watch back the recording, and I hope you'll consider grabbing a copy of the book from Country Bookshop.